April 3, 1996. A dirt track in the forest outside Lincoln, Montana. The air still carries the cold of a mountain winter. A small wooden cabin stands among the pines, 10 feet by 12, no electricity, no running water, no telephone. A thin line of smoke rises from its chimney, and along the tree line, moving slowly and without a sound, federal agents close in. Inside the cabin is a man the FBI has been hunting for almost 18 years. They do not know his face. They do not know his name. They know him only by a code name, stitched together from the letters of his targets, UNABOM, the university and airline bomber. When the agents finally knock, the man who opens the door is thin, bearded, dressed in worn clothes. He looks like a hermit, a recluse, a man the modern world forgot. He does not look like the most wanted domestic terrorist in the United States, but he is. His name is Theodore John Kaczynski, and for 17 years, from this cabin in the woods, he waged a one-man war against the modern world, a campaign of mail bombs that ran longer, cost more, and frustrated more agents than any manhunt in the history of the FBI. This is FBI Files USA, and today we open the file on the UNABOMer, how a child prodigy with one of the sharpest minds in America became a domestic terrorist, how he stayed invisible for almost 2 decades, and how, in the end, he was undone not by a fingerprint or a witness, but by the one thing he could never disguise, the sound of his own voice on paper. If cases like this interest you, subscribe. We open a new file every week. To understand how this man slipped through the largest manhunt of its era, you have to understand who he was before any of it began. Because Theodore Kaczynski did not start as a recluse in the woods. He started as one of the most gifted students America had ever produced. He was born in Chicago in 1942, the son of working-class parents of Polish descent. From the very beginning, it was clear the boy was extraordinary. His IQ was measured well above genius level. He skipped grades. He devoured mathematics the way other children read comic books. By the age of 16, Theodore Kaczynski was admitted to Harvard University. 16 years old at Harvard, surrounded by men years older than him. He was brilliant, and he was utterly alone. Classmates remembered him as silent, withdrawn, almost invisible. A boy who would pass you in the hallway and never raise his eyes. While at Harvard, Kaczynski took part in a psychological study. For 3 years, students were subjected to intense, deliberately hostile interrogations designed to break down their personal beliefs and stress them to their limits. Kaczynski was one of the most heavily tested subjects. Whatever that experience did to a withdrawn, isolated teenager, it did not heal him. Many who later studied his life pointed to those years as a wound that never closed. But academically, he was unstoppable. He earned a doctorate in mathematics from the University of Michigan, solving a problem so difficult that one of his professors said perhaps a dozen people in the country could have understood it. In 1967, at just 25 years old, Theodore Kaczynski became the youngest assistant professor of mathematics in the history of the University of California, Berkeley. He had reached the summit of American academic life, a tenured path at one of the greatest universities in the world, a mind the system had spent 2 decades cultivating. And then, 2 years later, without warning and without explanation, he quit. He simply walked away. Colleagues were stunned. He gave no reason. He just stopped. For a few years he drifted. And then, in 1971, with his brother's help, he bought a small piece of land outside Lincoln, Montana, and built the cabin with his own hands. He intended to disappear from modern society completely, to live off the land, grow his own food, hunt, and rely on nothing the industrial world produced. But the world would not leave him alone. Roads were built. Engines echoed through valleys that had once been silent. A patch of wild land where he liked to walk was developed. To Kaczynski, every one of these intrusions was proof of a single idea that had been hardening inside him for years, that modern technological society was not progress. It was a prison, It was destroying human freedom, and it had to be stopped. Most people who think this way write an angry letter or a book, or simply grumble about it. Kaczynski decided to wage war, and in 1978, that war began. In May of that year, a package was found in a parking lot at the University of Illinois at Chicago. It was addressed to an engineering professor at a different school. When it was returned to the name listed as the sender, another professor, and that man asked campus security to open it, the device inside detonated. The injuries were minor. At the time, it looked like an isolated, almost amateurish incident. It was not isolated. It was the first shot. Over the next 17 years, the bombs kept coming. They arrived in the mail or were left in places where a curious hand would find them. They went to universities, to professors of engineering, computer science, genetics, psychology. They went to the airline industry. In 1979, a device was placed aboard an American Airlines flight. It began to smoke in the cargo hold, and only a faulty timer kept it from doing far worse. Because the bomber's targets clustered around universities and airlines, the FBI built its code name from those words, UNABOM. And the unknown man behind them became the UNABOMber. And the campaign did not stay still. In the early years, the devices were crude, built to injure, sometimes failing outright. But Kaczynski was, above everything else, a methodical mind. He studied his own failures. He refined his designs. Year by year, the bombs grew smaller, more reliable, more deadly. A man trained to solve the hardest problems in mathematics was now applying that same patience to a single, terrible engineering task. There were long silences. Sometimes a year or more would pass with nothing. The country would almost forget him. And then another package would arrive, and the fear would return. In 1985, for the first time, one of his devices took a life. A man who picked up a bomb left in a parking lot near a computer store in California. Years later, in the mid-1990s, 2 more attacks proved fatal, targeting an advertising executive and a leading figure in the timber industry. By then, the FBI understood it was no longer dealing with a vandal or a crank. It was dealing with a patient, escalating threat that had been learning quietly for nearly 2 decades. In total, between 1978 and 1995, 16 devices were attributed to him. 3 people lost their lives. 23 more were injured, many of them severely and permanently. The victims were not chosen because of who they were as people. Most were strangers to him, selected because of what they represented, the science, the technology, the institutions he had come to hate. And here is what made the case a nightmare for investigators. The UNABOMber was, in the language of criminal investigation, almost the perfect offender. He left no fingerprints. He sanded surfaces, wore gloves, and even used pieces of wood and scavenged metal so that components could not be traced to a store. He built his devices by hand from scratch, sometimes machining his own screws. He used stamps that had been handled by no one the investigators could find. He never telephoned. He never used an informant. He worked completely alone, told no one, and operated on a timeline so slow, months, sometimes years between attacks, that there was no rhythm to track, no pattern to predict. He did not want money. He did not want recognition under his own name. He did not belong to any group that could be infiltrated. Almost everything the FBI relies on to catch a criminal, a motive that points somewhere, a network with a weak link, physical evidence that leads to a place, the UNABOMber had stripped away. By the early 1990s, the UNABOM case had become the longest and most expensive investigation in FBI history. A dedicated task force was based in San Francisco, pulling in agents, postal inspectors, and analysts from agencies across the government. They reviewed thousands of suspects. They chased down tens of thousands of tips. They produced a now-famous sketch, a man in a hooded sweatshirt and aviator sunglasses, his face almost entirely hidden, based on a single distant glimpse by a witness years earlier. That sketch was everywhere, and it told the public the truth without meaning to. After more than a decade and millions of dollars, this was still the clearest picture the FBI had of its man. A hood, sunglasses, no face at all. Inside the task force, the frustration was constant. Every promising lead dissolved. Profilers built a portrait of the offender, and parts of it were wrong, sending agents toward the wrong kind of suspect for years. Investigators chased the theory that the bomber had a background in aircraft or hard science and worked through long lists of people who fit. They examined the wood used in the devices, the types of glue, the brands of stamp. They studied the postmarks, trying to map where the man lived from where his packages entered the mail. Tens of thousands of tips came in from the public. Each one had to be logged, ranked, and run down. Almost none of them led anywhere. The pressure was enormous. The case had its own task force, its own budget line, its own place in the nightmares of FBI leadership. And still, the central fact never changed. Nobody knew who he was. The man had built a wall between himself and the entire investigative apparatus of the United States, and for 17 years, that wall held. The case looked unsolvable. And then the UNABOMer made the one decision that would end his freedom. He decided he wanted to be heard. In 1995, the bomber sent letters to several major newspapers with an offer, or more accurately, a threat wrapped as an offer. He had written a document, a manifesto, 35,000 words titled Industrial Society and Its Future. In it, he laid out his entire worldview, that the industrial technological system had stripped human beings of freedom and dignity, and that it had to be brought down. His demand was simple. If a major newspaper published the manifesto in full, he would stop sending bombs. If they refused, the campaign would continue. And the manifesto itself was not the raving of an obviously broken mind, which is part of what made it so unsettling. It was long, organized, and coldly logical. It argued that the industrial technological system, by its very nature, forces human beings into narrow, controlled lives, that each new technology, sold as freedom, quietly removes another piece of real autonomy, and that the system can never be reformed from within, only broken. Many readers found the conclusions monstrous. The author was, after all, demanding the right to keep sending bombs. But more than a few admitted, uncomfortably, that parts of the diagnosis touched something real about modern life. That tension is exactly why the document spread, why it was argued over in newspapers and around dinner tables, and why it still circulates today. The UNABOMer had not just sent a threat, he had sent an idea, and ideas are far harder to contain than explosives. This put the FBI and the Department of Justice in an extraordinary position. Negotiating with a terrorist by handing him a national platform was something law enforcement is built to refuse. But the alternative was the near certainty of more attacks, more lives at risk. After intense internal debate, the Attorney General and the Director of the FBI made a recommendation that shocked many: publish it. In September 1995, The Washington Post, with the New York Times sharing the cost, printed the entire manifesto as a special supplement. The reasoning was not surrender. It was a gamble, a hope, faint but real, that somewhere in America, someone would read those 35,000 words and recognize the mind behind them. The gamble worked, but not in the way anyone expected. In a suburb far from Montana, a woman named Linda Patrick read about the manifesto and felt a chill of recognition. She urged her husband to read it. Her husband was a quiet social worker named David Kaczynski, and David had an older brother named Ted, a brilliant, troubled recluse who had cut himself off from the family and was living alone somewhere in the Montana woods. David did not want it to be true. He loved his brother. For months, he wrestled with it. He compared the manifesto to old letters Ted had written him over the years. Letters full of the same ideas, the same phrases, the same precise, formal, deeply angry style. The arguments were the same. The vocabulary was the same. Certain unusual turns of phrase appeared in both. Think about the weight of what David was now holding. This was not a stranger. This was his older brother, The brilliant, damaged boy he had grown up admiring. The man he had personally helped buy that land in Montana. To act on his suspicion was to betray the deepest bond a person can have. To ignore it was to gamble the lives of strangers on being wrong. David Kaczynski faced a decision almost too heavy to imagine: to stay silent and protect his brother, or to go to the FBI and almost certainly send his own brother to prison for the rest of his life, while knowing that silence might cost more strangers their lives. He spent sleepless months on it. He consulted a private investigator and a lawyer before he could bring himself to act. He has said since that he believed, when he made the call, that he might be sending his own brother to be executed. Through a lawyer, and on the condition that the family's role be handled with discretion, David Kaczynski contacted the FBI. He gave them a name. He gave them the old letters. And now the task force had something it had never had in 17 years: a suspect and a sample of his writing. What followed was one of the most important applications of a still young investigative science: forensic linguistics. FBI analysts placed the manifesto side by side with Ted Kaczynski's personal letters and academic writing. They were not looking at handwriting. They were looking at something deeper and far harder to fake: the fingerprint of a mind, sentence structure, word choice, distinctive spellings, the rhythm of an argument, the particular way this one man built a paragraph. The match was overwhelming. The same rare phrases, the same idiosyncratic style, the same intellectual machinery. The manifesto and the letters had been written by the same person. It was enough. In April 1996, agents obtained a warrant and traveled to the cabin outside Lincoln, Montana. They approached carefully. They had no idea what the cabin might contain. They lured Kaczynski to the door, and they took him without a struggle. Inside that 10 by 12-foot cabin, investigators found the proof that ended any doubt. They found bomb components. They found tools. They found chemicals and wiring and carefully organized materials. They found a finished, ready device, wrapped and prepared to be sent. And they found Kaczynski's own writings, detailed journals in which he had recorded his experiments, his intentions, and his attacks in his own hand. The cabin was such overwhelming evidence that the FBI did something almost without precedent. They did not just photograph it. They took the entire cabin. The whole structure was lifted off its foundation, hauled out of the Montana woods, and preserved as evidence. And it would later sit in a federal facility, the strangest exhibit in one of the strangest cases the Bureau had ever worked. Theodore Kaczynski was charged. To avoid a trial that would have dragged for years, he eventually pleaded guilty to all federal charges against him. In 1998, he was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of release and sent to the federal Supermax facility in Florence, Colorado, a place built to hold the most dangerous prisoners in the country. He remained there for the rest of his life. In June 2023, at the age of 81, Theodore Kaczynski was found dead in his cell at a federal prison medical center. 17 years of bombings, almost 18 years of investigation, and a quarter century behind bars. The file, at last, was closed. So what does this case leave behind? For the FBI, the UNABOM investigation is remembered as a turning point. It showed, painfully, the limits of traditional detective work against a patient, isolated, motiveless offender. For 17 years, fingerprints and forensics and informants, the entire normal toolkit, produced almost nothing. The case was not broken by a crime lab. It was broken by a family member who recognized a voice, and by analysts who could prove that a voice belongs to a single human being as surely as a fingerprint belongs to a single hand. Forensic linguistics, after the UNABOM, was never treated as a minor curiosity again. It also left behind a hard question that law enforcement still studies. By publishing the manifesto, did the FBI reward a terrorist with the platform his entire campaign had been demanding? Or did that decision, controversial, uncomfortable, almost an act of desperation, save lives by putting the one clue that mattered in front of the one reader who could use it? Both things are true at once, and that is exactly why the case is still taught. The UNABOMer wanted to prove that one determined man, living off the grid with nothing but his own hands and his own mind, could strike at the heart of modern society and never be caught. For 17 years, he very nearly proved it. What finally found him was not a machine, not a database, not the technological system he despised. It was a brother who loved him, made an impossible choice, and the unmistakable, unforgeable pattern of his own words. This was FBI Files USA. If you want to understand the real cases and the real investigations behind the headlines, subscribe. We open a new file every week. Thanks for watching, and we will see you in the next one.